Dan Dunkevich, and welcome to the briefing. This year's World Economics Forum at Davos was notable for a seismic shift away from climate change and ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance, with an overwhelming focus on national security, NATO, and business growth. Now, being a very political meeting, the spin machines were running at full steam. And we've parsed through the official statements, listened to speeches, read some commentary, and we're going to bring you a concise view of what really happened at Davos 2026. The star of the show, of course, is Greenland, with much of the reporting associated with that. Now, we finished with the Trump-Rutte Greenland framework, and that seems to signal the end of the harsh negotiations concerning managing the strategic security of the island. It's worth noting that the United States has considered Greenland strategically important since the early 19th century and has sought to acquire the territory numerous times. This is no out-of-the-blue Trump canard. Now, critics, however, have scorned the president's over-the-top pronouncements and threats. Understandably so. Supporters said this was just an art of the deal and he got what he was after. So let's back up a little bit and talk a little about how we got here. Now, before Trump's first term, essentially nothing was spent on security. We have a base there, not very many people. The rest of NATO and Denmark really hadn't spent anything to secure the island. 2019, under pressure from Trump, Denmark pledged $224 million, but has since done pretty much nothing. New pressure from Trump in 2025 led Denmark to pledge nearly $10 billion. Now we have a de-escalation and a framework deal within NATO. Now, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte agreed to a, quote, Arctic Sentry, end quote, to monitor Russian and Chinese activity, modeled after the existing Baltic Sentry elsewhere in NATO. Rutte also noted that non-Arctic NATO members are expected to contribute, framing defense of Greenland as a collective burden rather than just a Danish or an American one. So this was a big change and good for America, certainly. Quote from Rutte, "It is up to NATO commanders to work through the details. I have no doubt we can do this quite fast, certainly in early 2026. That would be very impressive if they could move that quickly. Now, a primary component of the deal is Greenland's involvement in the U.S. Golden Dome missile system. Now, for the Golden Dome to work correctly, these rockets will have to be placed on the island to intercept any Russian rockets, any Russian ICBMs coming over the poles. That's why Greenland is very important for Golden Dome. Also, the deal gives the U.S. military, as Trump said, quote, all the military access we want, implying the ability to station more troops at more bases without case-by-case friction of the past. Now, in the past, it's been very difficult for the U.S. to expand presence or to get NATO involved. So this seems to deal with all of those previous concerns. Mineral rights for the U.S. may also be part of the finalized deal. Trump saying that they are, Rutte saying we didn't really talk about that. So we'll see if that becomes important. Mineral rights, of course, will surface around the idea of these rare earth minerals. Now, the other big thing that happened was the emergence of Euro-NATO self-reliance. I say it that way because, I mean, not just America, NATO, because most of NATO has been America and then everyone providing a little bit, but America providing the majority of it. But now the idea of Europeans looking at their portion of NATO and taking charge of it. So for decades, American presidents have tried to push NATO countries to invest in their own security to no avail and only end up America having to pay for everything. Secretary Bessent said that since the early 1980s, the U.S. has invested $22 trillion, more than all other NATO countries combined. And this has amounted to America subsidizing European domestic spending on things like trains and healthcare. Trump, with significant help from Putin's barbarity, pushed all NATO countries, with the exception of Spain, to agree to a pledge of 5% of their GDP to be spent on defense, which is up from less than 1%. This is part of last year's Hague Agreement. But there have been questions as to whether European nations would follow through on their promise, which past performance would indicate. Hence, during the lead up to Davos, Trump kept the rhetoric high. However, during his speech, he ratcheted this down significantly and removed tariff threats. His statement that he, quote, loves Europe, but only a strong Europe, was pretty resonant and spoke to what he seems to have really been after. Some worry that his volcanic previous statements may have pushed NATO allies away from the U.S., as shown in Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech. Much commentary and sound bites focused on this aspect, and it is likely true that there has been a cost to America for Trump's extreme rhetoric. Nerves are frayed and stability shaken furiously. Now, whether this is a short-term or a long-term impact is yet to be seen. However, listening to NATO's Rutte, Italy's Meloni, and Germany's Merz, it looks more like Europe is evolving into a more steadfast bloc, still aligned with America, but not as defenseless siblings, more as strong partner. It may well be that Trump is happy to be the bad guy, as long as he keeps fickle European bureaucrats from slowing down their NATO buildup. Furthermore, the Russian and the Chinese, they do not waffle, a habit that Europe has raised to an art form. America needs a strong and decisive Europe. This will mean that we will butt heads sometimes, but that's better than weakness, vacillation, or naivete. This naivete was the root of the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines and Germany's pivot away from nuclear energy, which has been disastrous. It was pointed out the European nations continue to buy petroleum products and energy from Russia, which is essentially financing the war against themselves. This is somewhat nonsensical. Some of it is unavoidable, but some of it is probably still avoidable. Now, the next section was a pivot towards business growth. Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Germany's Friedrich Merz called for radical improvements in Europe's stifling regulatory regime. This is in stark contrast to talking about climate change and ESG. Meloni said, quote, "We cannot afford a Green Deal that becomes a suicide pact for our industry. Our proposal is simple. For every new regulation introduced, 2 must be abolished. We need to breathe," end quote. Both spoke of pragmatism over ideology. This is a big shift. This hopefully will be remembered at a point where Europe began to move away from stagnation and potential decline toward a renewal of industry and growth. Now, EU GDP growth has lagged behind the U.S. for 17 of the last 25 years. I'll give a bunch of numbers here. So cumulative, the U.S. GDP from 2000 to 2025 has outperformed EU by 18%. And one way of measuring it, I'll put it in dollars. The EU GDP in 2000 was 15 trillion. In 2025 was 28 trillion, almost doubling. The U.S. went from 10 trillion to 30 trillion, tripling. So we went from being well behind the EU to ahead of them. Per capita, the U.S. leads the EU at $89,000 versus $65,000. All those numbers were regulated into dollars. It isn't the economic output per se, however, that really caught my attention. It was Europe awakening from a slumber of self-doubt and even self-hate. Meloni has been persistent, talking about protecting and celebrating Western culture. After decades of being told that Western culture is somehow to blame for all the troubles in the world, a claim that is ridiculous, by the way, it's good to see springtime for a culture that has brought almost all of humanity's greatest inventions. But that topic is a briefing all in itself. Let's get back to business. So AI was predictably the headline. And important speeches were given by NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, BlackRock's CEO's Larry Fink, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, Citadel's Ken Griffin, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, and of course, Elon Musk. We'll cover the most interesting underreported business talks in the next briefing. And that's the briefing for today. If you've liked this, please like and subscribe.